Welcome back to Reps to GOG. I'm Tectonic Improv, and it's time for a review. Today we return with the second half of the digital Devil Saga duology. Released a mere 6 months after the original DDS in the States, Shin Megami Tensei Digital Devil Saga 2 picks up right where the first game left off, with Serf... wait.
Stop!
Alright, here we go. DDS2 picks up with Serf, Gale, and Argilla reunited in the real world, Nirvana, after they escaped the crumbling Junkyard, a simulated world not too dissimilar to the likes of, say, The Matrix or something. Their goal is to find the rest of the gang, including the mysterious Sarah, and basically figure out what in the world is going on. Viewers of the first DDS review on Reps to GOG will recall that I showered the original game with loads of praise, so how does the direct sequel follow up such a well-crafted game? The short of it? It's great. Really great. Albeit weaker than the first in some aspects. Aspects I'm sure to discuss shortly. Before we get started though, I'd like to mention that while working on these Digital Devil Saga videos, I contacted former Atlas employee Tomm Hulett, who worked as a localizer for both Digital Devil Saga games alongside other Atlas titles. He graciously agreed to answer some questions I had about the development of DDS 1 and 2, and I'll be sure to sprinkle these insights when relevant throughout the review. In addition, there will be a Medium article in the description with the full transcript of the interview for those curious, but I digress, let's get started. Many of the facets of DDS2 are functionally identical to DDS1, making my usual formatting of reviews difficult. I'm only going to cover the major differences to the gameplay as opposed to repeating the same talking points I used for the original review. First off, the mantra system has been retooled. Instead of skills being on a linear path, there's a large grid, and party members can unlock new hexagons on the grid by mastering an adjacent point. This doesn't change things as much as you might think, but I believe it's still the better system. It allows the player a little extra freedom when building their party members' suite of skills. A change they probably deemed necessary for, reasons. Like I said though, it's not a huge departure from the original, and not completely elegant. Since one party member unlocking a mantra doesn't unlock it for everyone else, each of them will have different paths on the grid. Inevitably, this will lead to the player having to unlock mantras they aren't interested in just to reach one that they are. These unwanted skills usually have little relevance to the character in question as well. It's not a complete nightmare though, since money is just as plentiful as DDS1, if not more so. Oh, and they also fixed one of the skills being called Wikipedia of all things. Tom told me that he considered that their biggest slip-up when localizing the game. As for additional major gameplay changes, there's two more, although one is bigger than the other. Starting off small, we have the Karma Ring system. Karma Rings are accessories that can be upgraded with items found throughout the game to augment your stats. If you build them right, you can give your characters pretty significant boosts with this system. Some rings give you additional abilities in battle, like transforming from human to demon costing 0 turns, combo attacks costing 1 less turn, an autokaja effect, etc. I actually found myself really liking this addition to the game. It gives you a little more versatility with your builds. In fact, I found myself liking it a lot more than the other gameplay change, and that's the new Berserk Mode, a feature Atlas considered substantial enough to put on the back of the case. Berserk Mode is a new type of battle which occurs commonly when the solar phase is at its maximum, although I've had it happen to me when it was at 7/8 as well. All of your party members will be in a hybrid form between human and demon, sporting a weak defense and a restriction on anything but physical skills. Physical skills are also much more likely to crit in this form, but they're also more likely to miss. To incentivize fighting during the Berserk Mode, rewards for killing demons are cranked up by quite a bit. This was a feature I was initially negative about, but came to somewhat appreciate over the course of the game. The reason being that accuracy during these fights was incredibly low in the early game, to an absurd degree. It was only around the mid-game where my party had leveled up more when I could begin to see the Berserk Mode battles bear fruit. Even still, if these weren't in the game, I wouldn't miss them. I get why they'd advertise this as a major feature, but if anything, the karma rings were more meaningful. Before moving on from gameplay changes, I would like to give a shout out to the Jack Frost quiz show battles, something that appeared a total of 2 times in my playthrough. The first being in one of the early game dungeons and is likely its scripted introduction, and the second time appearing in the final dungeon of the game. I'm curious about how these encounters are decided, and if I'm just truly unlucky or not. I would have really liked to have seen more of these, since they give you special items when you answer the questions correctly. Before we dive into the story, I want to get some more miscellaneous thoughts out there, since once we enter the story section, we're going to be in there a while. Let's get some more complaints out of the way. This may seem like a nitpick to some, but I was let down by the lack of variety in the battle themes in comparison to the original digital Devil Saga. The different battle themes for random encounters, surprise encounters, mini-bosses, regular bosses, other Atma users, to name a few, really helped to give variety to battles. I think it's one of the secrets that make battling in that game so exciting. To be clear, Digital Devil Saga 2 has some great battle themes, one of which is Hunting Betrayal, a reprisal of the original battle theme, which is giving me goosebumps just writing about it. But throughout my playthrough, I couldn't help but notice less variety. One big example were the surprise encounters. Now look, was the surprise encounter theme in DDS1 a completely new track? No, but it was a distinct enough remix of the original battle theme to fit the mood of being caught off guard. DDS2's surprise encounter theme is just the regular battle theme, which is a good track, don't get me wrong, but it's strange to go from something to nothing. Another thing that I found myself unsure about was the game's erratic party composition. Without getting too deep into spoiler territory, let's just say that a lot of your party members come and go, and it usually isn't expected. On one hand, DDS2 really swings for the fences in this regard, and I have to applaud it for that. Sadly, I felt this came at the cost of another aspect that drew me into DDS1, and that was its fast pace. Each party member has a unique starting point in the mantra grid, which pushes you to specialize into certain abilities. Again, this is a good system. But what happens when, for example, your primary healer leaves the party? You'll have to rely on an off healer, or send another party member down the healing sector of the mantra grid at the cost of their primary abilities. In my playthrough, this resulted in me having to grind party members throughout the grid after a major party member left due to a moment in the story. The grinding wasn't excessive, but it was there. In an inverse to the battle music critique I levied earlier, it was a tad disappointing to go from none to some. Also, due to reasons, I didn't have a single party member that specialized in physical attacks, which wasn't a major issue, but did become a recurring blind spot in my battle strategies. The only candidate for a physical build ended up being Serph, who I decided to specialize in magic this time instead. Which I think was the correct call, despite my lack of a physical attacker. That said, there's more of a case to be made to make Serph physical due to this possible hole in party dynamics. Oh, also his character portrait looks different, and not as good if you ask me. It really confused me, because no one else's looked different, why change his? I've been pretty down on Digital Devil Saga 2 so far, mostly because I wanted to point out aspects of the game that I felt were lesser when compared to the original. Both games are very similar, so because of that, flaws were easier to notice during my playthrough, but that goes both ways. Positives were amplified as well. The dungeons of DDS2 I found were noticeably better than the first. DDS1 resorted to a lot of the common Atlas dungeon tropes of indecipherable mazes, teleporting floors, you name it. Meanwhile, Digital Devil Saga 2 has... okay, well it also has these, but I feel like they're much more manageable this time. Take, for instance, the second visit to the egg installation. For one, it has a really grim atmosphere, increased by the fact that we've seen this place before Hell broke loose not too long ago. But as for the main gimmick of finding the correct portal, it's actually not solved by dumb luck. Observant players will notice an increasingly loud roar from the correct portal, whereas dead-end portals are silent. I think that's a good way of blending classic dungeon crawling with puzzle solving. I also like the prison dungeon, if only for how unique it is. Escaping a kambana so you can feed it spoiled canned meat is an experience I can only get from Digital Devil Saga 2. The final dungeon was another highlight. Its aesthetic was quite unique, its difficulty not too cruel, and was appropriately epic. And it's a good thing it is, because it's basically the finale for not just DDS2, but also DDS1. But alright, without holding off any longer, why don't we get into the story, which is what I believe to be DDS2's greatest strength. Digital Devil Saga 2's story is not in an enviable position. Most follow-ups have a lot to live up to, but DDS2 has it especially rough due to how DDS1's story is told. The first game's story, while somewhat sparse at times, still managed to leave the player with enough unanswered questions to meet the quota of a season of Lost. So not only does DDS story have to be satisfying on its own, but it also has to answer all of these questions posited in DDS1, or else both stories will suffer. Well, I can safely say that DDS2's story manages to pull both of these requirements off with aplomb. The plot kicks off with Serph alongside Gale and Argilla, attempting to regroup with the rest of the Embryon with the help of a boy named Fred. Right off the bat, we get some pretty major questions about the world answered. For one, the Promised Land was nothing but a new hell. The real world that harbored the simulation known as the Junkyard is in shambles, torn apart by something called the Cuvier syndrome, which turns any human exposed to the sun into stone. Humanity has almost entirely been driven underground and are subjugated by the Karma Society, the foundation that initiated hell on Earth. So right away we have plenty of motivation. To get a minor gripe out of the way though, I thought it was strange that the plot of the game began here, when the first game ended with Serph separated from the group. I would have liked to have seen Gale and Argilla meeting up with Serph again, but I guess the cool intro will have to suffice. No etro anime this time though, sadly. But on that note, I asked Tom to see if he knew why they even decided to put an insert song into the intro of DDS1, and he theorized it was because the insert song they put in Disgaea was received positively by fans at the time. Nocturne was a decent hit, so they were likely hoping lightning would strike twice. Whether that was a factor in Digital Devil Saga's success or not over here, I'm not sure. Still love that track though, but I digress. Soon enough, Fred introduces the remaining Embryon to the misanthropic Roland, or Rold if you're playing the Japanese version, who leads a group in opposition to the Karma Society. He reluctantly agrees to help them and eventually is won over to Serph's cause. The game kinda speeds through the early stages of Roland's character arc, likely as a way to get you a new party member as soon as possible. Throughout the early game, as you regain your lost party members one by one, you may notice that Heat, the renegade member of the Embryon, is absent for quite some time. It's only once the gang infiltrates the Karma Society's base of operations do we get reintroduced to him, although there's a catch.
He's hiding something.
Have you gone mad? I've made my choice!
What's wrong with you?
The entirety of the first Digital Devil Saga was practically leading up to this inevitable betrayal, but it still hurts all the same. He is incredibly protective of Sarah and has decided to side with the Karma Society and its enigmatic leader, Madame Cuvier, to keep her safe. In turn, the Embryon temporarily side with Jenna Angel, the final boss of the first game. The reason why the sun is eclipsed and turned humanity to stone is also revealed as a punishment from God, or at the very least a being that is referred to as God. The more astute viewers may have recognized the familiar dichotomy of Jenna and Madame Cuvier. In any other Shin Megami Tensei title, they would likely be the Order and Chaos alignment representatives respectively. Roland seems like he'd make a pretty good neutral rep himself. I appreciated that nod to the way mainline Megami Tensei chooses to tell its stories. DDS2 is a spin-off through and through though, and while certain dialogue choices impart mechanical ramifications, there's no way to side with Madame Cuvier. Anyway, after the Karma Society was a huge bust, Jenna informs them that Sarah is being held in a place called the Egg Installation, so the gang goes there next. And by the end of this dungeon, things begin to get turned completely on their heads, because up to this point, DDS2 has had something of a second verse same as the first energy to it. What with it being a direct sequel, that makes sense, and isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it helps that from here on out, DDS2's story comes into its own, and begins to feel like the explosive finale promised by its predecessor. He confronts Serph, and in a genuinely shocking moment, stabs him and sends them both falling to their deaths. And with that, for the foreseeable future, Serph is gone. The main character, the guy who is most likely your strongest character, is out of the party. This leaves the player wounded, as there's an entire dungeon that must be explored before the next major party member officially joins. It also hurts the characters in-game. It was no secret that Serf, up to this point, wasn't really much of a character, but he was well liked by the rest of his peers, and so at the very least, if you don't care about Serf, you likely care about Gale, Cielo, or Argilla, who are all reeling over this loss. With Serf gone, Gale is given the leadership role, which I found somewhat odd, admittedly, because while Gale is a tactician, he doesn't have the presence of a leader. Personally, I think that Argilla should have been given the leadership role in Serf's absence. She's got the compassion and charisma befitting a leader, and has much more to say than Gale in almost every scene she's in. If I had to pick a favorite character from DDS, it would probably be Argilla, which is something me and Tomm have in common. Serf's sacrifice isn't the end of the bloodshed though. In fact,
we've only just begun.
As Argilla and Roland both sacrifice themselves in an effort to protect Gale, Cielo, and Sarah, who was rescued by the Embryon thanks to Serf's efforts earlier. They straight up die, in a pretty gruesome manner I might add. This helps Sarah to awaken to her own Atma abilities, so thankfully we're not down to only 2 party members. In addition, her stats and mantra skills are identical to Serf's. Personally not a fan of her demon form though, the pink color scheme and the skirt feel a little too feminine. Especially when I feel Varna, Serf's form, didn't have overtly masculine physical features on his. Criticisms about her appearance aside, her getting Serf's abilities is a good way to make the work spent towards Serf's leveling not feel worthless, and it gave my party its powerful core back. That said, it was this point where I felt as though I needed to grind the most. Roland had most of my buffs, whereas Argilla specialized in healing. I discussed this earlier, so I won't dwell on it. With Sarah's newfound resolve, the remaining Embryon returned to the egg installation so she can parley with God and convince it that humanity is worth protecting and to return the Earth to its former glory. Before she can do that though, the Embryon have to confront Heat, or rather what's left of him. This is probably one of the toughest fights in the game, but also has one of the best battle themes in the game, the aforementioned hunting betrayal. Once Heat is defeated, we get rewarded with the plot dump to end all plot dumps, the Rosetta Stone to the digital Devil Saga plot. And I guess this would be another good opportunity to reiterate that you really should play this game before watching this review. My story synopsis is more of a Cliff Notes version of the plot with my thoughts on the events. I didn't even talk about these guys. Don't you want to know what these guys' deal is?
Whoa, what a freak! Sheesh, where did they find these guys?
Alright, you've been warned. So here's the big reveal. The Embryon we've been playing as are actually analogs of real people. We saw a small glimpse of this in the end of DDS1, but now it's completely unveiled. The people the Embryon were based off of were scientists tasked with studying Sarah and her unique abilities. During this time, Sarah underwent a lot of stress, and created the Junkyard and its inhabitants as a coping mechanism. The denizens of which had personalities that were based off Sarah's perspective of them, but that's the rub. They're based off of Sarah's perspective, not how they actually are. And never is this more clear than with Serf. The Embryon Serf is a stoic, strong leader who cares deeply for his comrades, whereas the real Serf is, well, there's no clearer way to say this, a sociopath. He led the experiments on Sarah and cared little for her well-being. In a poetic twist, Heat's real-world analog is Serf's biggest critic. Only this time, his objections are much more understandable. Their infighting comes to a head when real Serf and real Heat are fatally wounded, causing Sarah to break down, and set into motion the Cuvier syndrome that soon ravaged the world. It's a pretty huge twist to make your main character, or at least something close to your main character, be not just a catalyst for every event in the game, but also a genuine bastard. They really lay it on with him too, he even talks.
Simple, huh? The human heart is a machine. We can predict the outcome of any action. Considering my goal is God's power, people are just tools.
Once this revelation is unveiled, it's revealed that both Heat and Serf survived their confrontation. However, Heat doesn't make it much longer, and passes away shortly after letting go of his grudge against Serf. This event also leaves the egg installation in shambles, making it impossible to communicate with God using it, so a plan is hatched to head to an airport and fly to a backup location that's capable of transmitting data to God. Completing this area is the game's point of no return, and so there's some optional content you can tackle beforehand. I decided to take out the Archangels, one of the game's secret bosses, partly as a way to make it up to you all for not fighting the Demi-Fiend in 1, and partly because I wanted to see how powerful my party was now that I had Serph back. Atlus had quite a few different ways to approach reintroducing Serph to the party, so I'm glad they decided to give him back to you with all of his abilities intact and give him level parity with the rest of your party, allowing you to distribute the new levels wherever you want. I found it really satisfying to have so many points to distribute at once. Not to mention, Sarah doesn't leave your team. At this point, you're given 2 Serfs. Unfortunately, not many enemies were very weak to ice, but still, I felt strong. The airport is the penultimate dungeon, and where everything starts to really fall apart. For the characters, that is. Once they reach the terminal to ride on the plane, they're stopped by Jenna Angel, and this is where Gale says his goodbyes to the group, sacrificing himself to hold Jenna off. Although this scene feels a tad weird. I understand that Jenna had a relationship with the man Gale is based off of, and that played a part in Jenna sparing the rest of the Embryon. But the way this scene was directed made it feel a lot more understated than it really should have. You're telling me that they couldn't have all just walked past her? It sort of reads to me like a way to quickly kill off Gale before the finale. Although, before we move on, I would like to share a little fun fact about this scene. The voice actor for Gale, Steve Blum, and Jenna Angel, Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, actually got married a couple of years ago, long after these games were localized. Probably just a cute coincidence, but I wanted to bring it up nonetheless. Anyway, back to the firing squad. Mere moments later, Cielo sacrifices himself to protect Serph and Sarah while they head to the backup transmitter. Cielo's death, however, is much more realized than Gale's, at least in my opinion. With only Sarah and Serph left, the two link up their consciousness to communicate with God, and in the process, this leaves the two of them dead. So there we are. All the Embryon are dead. Game over, right? Well, not quite. Along with the fact that the Embryon are able to exist in the real world despite being programs, there's a lot of dialogue in the game that suggests that the concept of a soul and data from a computer are one and the same. So everyone's data begins to travel to the sun, which is, for all intents and purposes, God. In this process, Sarah and Serph's data begin to merge, and the two are reborn as one being, Serif. When their data reaches the surface of the sun, they're greeted by all of the Embryon, Gale, Cielo, Argilla, Heat, and even Roland. And that's where the final proper dungeon begins. As one final branching path, depending on what dialogue options you chose in DDS 1 and 2, your final party member will either be Heat or Roland. In my playthrough, I got Roland, which wasn't too surprising considering that I butted heads with Heat a few times throughout the games. Now, you might be tempted to roll your eyes at the fact that after all of your friends dying, you get to use them in the final dungeon anyway. But it's not as if they've been revived or anything. I don't feel as though this last hurrah cheapens any of the characters' deaths any more than they were when originally presented. The story from this point onward is fairly sparse. It's your typical final Mega 10 dungeon, long as fuck and carried by the gameplay. Speaking of which, Serif. You might be tempted to lament the loss of Sarah and Serph, but trust me when I say this, Serif is completely busted. Each of their stats is taken from whoever's total between Sarah and Serph's was higher. Their Atma avatar possesses no weaknesses, their mantra grid progression is combined between the two original characters, and if you played your cards right, like I did, then they get the reincarnation skill, an attack that functions as a history eraser button to most random encounters, provided Seraph was mind charged. This gigantic boon really put the wind in my sail for this final dungeon. I can't think of many games that give you such an advantage at the 11th hour, but maybe that's why I found it so memorable. That said, even with Seraph, the final dungeon is far from a cakewalk. There were a few problem fights along the way, but eventually the end was reached. The only way Seraph can speak with God is if they, of course, beat it in a JRPG battle. As far as final fights go, this one was pretty climactic. Compared to Angel, which I found to be a pretty long fight due to my build, this fight went a lot smoother. Once Brahman, or God, has been defeated, Seraph achieves enlightenment and casts God away so the Earth and its remaining inhabitants can rebuild. Before DDS2 closes the book though, it goes full circle. Giving context to the opening cutscene of the game, which showcased an adult Fred caring for children that resembled the Embryon. Well, now we know that the scene took place after the events of the game, and that the Embryon had all experienced reincarnation, including Serf and Sarah. It's a fantastic ending that tackles familiar concepts like Buddhism well. My favorite aspect is when Serif becomes enlightened and realizes that the most important part to becoming enlightened can be condensed into one simple word. We don't get this word in this cutscene, however, it's fairly easy to guess, but even still, after the credits there's a screen with the phrase, or mantra if you will, Shanti Shanti, which means peace. I don't know, maybe it sounds silly when spelled out like that, but I found it to be a really effective ending. In hindsight, I'm happy that I decided to review both of these games separately, not only because it made for a more pure experience, but it was also cool to look back at my DDS1 review and see things mentioned there addressed in this title. I really didn't expect the game to recontextualize Heat's betrayal the way they did. I swear I didn't put that line in the original review on purpose. Something I did expect to be explained was the relationship between Gale and Angel, which I also got. Got that and then some. Despite only being a duology, Digital Devil Saga managed to be jam-packed with memorable moments that make revisiting these titles in the future all the more enticing. Digital Devil Saga 2 swings more for the fences than its predecessor, and while I respect Atlus's decisions, I think it made for a rockier experience as a first-time player. Overall, Digital Devil Saga 1 is probably the more well-rounded game, but I gotta give DDS2 its fair due. A lot of the story in the first game is intentionally withheld from the player, with the intention that its sequel would be willing to do the heavy lifting of explaining all of it. Those are some pretty big shoes to fill, and thankfully DDS2 pulls it off. If DDS1 is a half-court pass, then DDS2 is the layup that wins the game. If there's a drop-off in quality, it's only a minor one, and is far from tarnishing the reputation of this small little series. DDS2 comes highly recommended from Reps to GOG. Any JRPG fan owes it to themselves to experience the Digital Devil Saga series. The Junkyard is waiting.